A number of years ago, a new version of the iPhone came out, and I had to have it. So I got in line, if I remember, about 11 in the morning, and I left 4 hours later with my phone. And imagine this is a mall in Southern California. The line went out of the Apple store and down, 3, 4, 5 stores. I'm standing there every 15 minutes, taking a few steps. These students walk up to this guy right next to me and word for word said, "We're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" He doesn't say a single word, turns around, leans on the railing, and ignores these students. So they're about to walk away. I stopped them. I said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" They said, "Well, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" I said, "I'm not even sure he existed. Do you really believe that Christian stuff?" They said, "Well, of course we do. Jesus, Son of God, died on the cross for your sins." They start preaching the gospel. And I just simply said, "Why should I believe that story?" And a student goes, "Well, it's right here in the Bible, the Word of God." I said, "How do you know I can trust that? And that it's the Word of God?" He goes, "Well, if you turn to this chapter in 2 Timothy, it tells all scriptures inspired." I said, "Okay, wait a minute. If we want to know if we can trust that book, you can't turn to a passage within that book, assuming it's trustworthy to prove itself." He goes, "Fair point." I said, "Is there any evidence outside of that book that helps confirm the claims within?" He said, "Yes, don't you know? There's these tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts that tell us we have the Bible exactly as it was written down." I said, "Really? Do you know how many words are in the ancient original Greek New Testament?" And at this point, I know exactly what he was thinking. Why did I have to talk to this guy? He said, "No." I said, "There's about 136,000 words. Do you know if you take all of those different manuscripts and compare them, there's between 300,000 and 400,000 differences. That means for every word in the New Testament, there could be 2 or 3 other words. Can you explain that to me?" He goes, "What do you think about evolution?" I said, "I'm glad you asked. The evidence is overwhelming. Don't you know we share 99.72% DNA similarity with monkeys and apes?" I said, "Haven't you seen biogeographical distribution and homologous structures?" I'm going on and on. And the guy's backing up like this. His eyes are getting bigger and bigger. Then I stopped. I said, "You know what? I got a confession to make. I'm a Christian." And I wish you could have seen his response. He goes, "Oh." A girl next to him looked genuinely bothered by this. She goes, "Was all that true?" I said, "Well, some yes, a lot of it no." I said, "Look, good for you guys. This was a July in Southern California, 10 minutes from the beach." I said, "You're at the mall sharing your faith. Good for you. But if you're going to tell people they should bank their lives on an ancient book, don't you think you should have some good reasons if that book's actually true?" They agreed, went in their way. Maybe 10 minutes later, I feel a tap on the shoulder. I turn around, and it's 3 new students who say, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" I was like, "Okay." So I start launching my charade until I look behind them. A little further back than the back of this room, I see the original students who set up their friends to convert the atheists. Now, that's exactly what some of you here tonight, I can tell, would have done. Now, I enjoy sharing this story, especially with young people saying, how would you have responded? How should they respond? Now, Peter writes in 1 Peter 3:15, it's to sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer or a response for the hope within and give it with gentleness and respect. In fact, the word for answer in Greek is apologia, which is where we get apologetics from. Apologetics means giving an answer for the hope within. Now, what we're going to talk about is not the question, is the Bible inspired? We're not going to ask the question, is the Bible authoritative? Those are important questions. We're not even asking if the Bible's inerrant. We're simply saying, can we trust the New Testament as a historical document as a whole? And we're going to compare it to ways that historians often assess other ancient books. And I'm gonna give you a simple acronym that you could write down or you could memorize. I don't have to write stuff down, I have photographic memory. I just don't have any film. If you don't know what that means, ask somebody over 35. 3 tests. Number 1, we're gonna look at these one by one. It's called the character test. Can we trust the character of the writer? Number 2, the copy test. Has the book been copied accurately and faithfully? And number 3, the corroboration test. Is there evidence outside of this that supports the claims within? Now, when Greg introduced me, he mentioned my father that I'm guessing a few of you are familiar with, Josh McDowell. My dad's spoken to more young people live on university campuses than anybody in history. Written over 150 books. What a lot of people don't know is my dad came from about as broken of a background as you can imagine. Now, I'll tell you more about that tomorrow, but my father was challenged to set out and disprove Christianity. Ended up being compelled by the evidence, and in 1972 wrote a book when there really was no apologetics books called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Well, recently we updated that book in about 6 years ago, about 2017. Now, what's interesting is part of the cool part about doing this book was I was able to ask my daddy, this fall he's celebrating 6 decades of faithful ministry. So I was able to ask him a lot of questions about how these issues have shifted over the past half century plus. And he made a statement, he goes, son, the evidence for Christianity is like a tsunami. Well, first off, my dad has never understated anything in his life, just for the record. But I thought I'm gonna write an article on his behalf, of course, have him approve it, make sure it says what he believes. And so we wrote an article called The Evidence for Christianity is Like a Tsunami. Fox News published it, and that week, the book Evidence That Demands Verdict launched into number 18, I think it was, on all of Amazon books. The number 2 Christian book behind Bob Goff. I hate that guy, no, I'm just kidding. Obviously kidding. Amazing writer. But why am I telling you this? Because I think there's a lot of people today, despite we're told live your truth and people don't care about truth, who are open to evidence for truth if we're willing to share it in the right way. We've got to be ready with an answer. So let's jump in and take a look at this. The first question is the character test. So really, was this document put together with honesty? Are there signs of integrity built within it? Well, the first place to look is, does the document actually claim this? That's the first place. And you'll notice how Luke begins his gospel. By the way, what was Luke's profession? He was a doctor, Paul tells us in Colossians 4. Luke 1 says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses. So Luke's not an eyewitness, but he investigated them, and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account so you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Luke begins his gospel that way, which is an ancient way of saying, I'm at least attempting to write a careful historical account. But Luke's not the only one. Peter now moves into the realm of being an eyewitness. He said, we did not follow cleverly invented stories or myths. We told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were what? Eyewitnesses of his majesty. Now notice John, I'm gonna put a phrase up here from 1 John 1:1, his letter. I want you to notice how many senses John appeals to. He says, what was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've looked at, what we have touched with our hands. How many senses? This is the participatory part of the program. 3, what we have heard, what we've looked at, what we've touched with our hands. In other words, these aren't stories we heard from somebody else over campfire. We investigated, we saw, we touched, we heard. Now that's the first part. Let's go a little bit deeper. When stories are made up, how do they often begin? Once upon a time, or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, what's interesting about many fictional stories is they're placed in distant lands that we can't investigate. Different time, different land. This is not what the biblical writers do. In fact, I want you to notice how many specific details Luke gives us in Luke 3. He says, now in the 15th year, not the 14th year, not the 16th year, the reign of Tiberius Caesar, not Julius Caesar, not Augustus Caesar, not Nero, when Pontius Pilate gives us his name and governor his position of Judea, the region, and Tetrarch was Tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was Tetrarch of the reign of Iturea, then he tells the story of the coming of Jesus. This is the opposite of a story in a distant land and a distant place. Luke says, these people, this time, this place, so we can check it out. And Luke is recognized as a very careful historian. Now let's go a little bit further. So the writers say we investigated truth. We saw it, we heard it. They place it in a specific place, but then they also give embarrassing material. Now, why is this important? Human nature is, if we make up stuff that's not true, it's to get out of trouble or to make ourselves look good. None of you woke up this morning and thought, you know what, I wonder what I can post on social media so everybody just thinks I'm a loser. You might have wondered what your friend's password is so you could do something on their behalf as a prank. In fact, my sister left her social media account open years ago, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's open. I just felt the need to let the world know on her behalf how incredibly wonderful her brother is. Now, the moment she saw it, she knew exactly it was me making it up, just having fun. Now, why am I telling you this? Because historians have something they call a criterion of embarrassment. That is, they look at a document, and if the writer in court records material that's disparaging to his or her own reputation, then more likely we can conclude that this is a writer that cares about truth, even though it comes at some cost. Criterion of embarrassment. So if you just read the Gospels, I mean, you could probably think of examples how many times the apostles mess up and do stuff that's embarrassing. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus calls Peter Satan. And this wasn't like sometimes friends will try to get the best insult of each other. Like, oh, it wasn't like Jesus called him Satan. He's like, oh, Jesus, you got me, man. Good one. That is not how this went down. That was the insult of insults. Why invent something like that to put it on Peter, whose confession was the rock of the church? How about the disciples falling asleep in Gethsemane at Jesus' moment of need? 3 times they fall asleep. Why invent that? Sometimes the disciples don't even understand the teachings of Jesus, and the women discover the empty tomb. Now, we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but a woman's testimony was not considered as significant a man's in that culture. So why invent that? It would be counterproductive. So if we just look at the Gospels, we have these writers saying in the New Testament, we investigated, we saw, we heard, they place in a specific time with exact people in exact places. They include embarrassing material, but then ultimately what convinces me is what it cost the apostles to believe. So according to church tradition, Peter was crucified, Andrew was crucified, Philip crucified, Bartholomew flayed to death, James the Great beheaded, Matthew killed the sword, Matthias stoned to death, and this has nothing to do with smoking pot. Thomas stabbed with spears, John died after exile, Luke hanged, James was thrown, beaten, Mark dragged death by horse, and Paul beheaded. Now, some of you are taking a picture of this. Delete that picture. Here's why. I said according to church tradition. I actually completed my doctoral dissertation on researching the death of the apostles. In fact, in about 6 weeks, I'm turning in an update on this. It's an academic book, probably 350 pages. I'm only telling you this because I spent years studying this. And for many of the apostles, it's hard to know when history ends and when tradition begins. I think we can confirm with high historical probability that at least these 4 died as martyrs, probably 2 more. Now, we don't actually have to show that they died as martyrs to make my point. Because here's what we know. Just read the beginning of Acts. The apostles believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. And they start proclaiming the risen Jesus. They're threatened and they're beaten and they're thrown in prison. What do? They won't stop. In fact, Peter in Acts 4 and Acts 5 stands up for the apostles and says, we will not stop proclaiming the risen Jesus because we fear God more than we fear men. Friends, you don't invent something you believe is false to intentionally put yourself in harm's way. Minimally, this tells us that they believed they had seen the risen Jesus and thought it was worth suffering for. A friend of mine who I mentioned earlier, my co-author on the book, So the Next Generation Will Know, was an atheist until he was 35. And they had kids, and his wife was like, we want our kids to have morals, so let's go to church. So they went and heard Rick Warren preach on the gospel at Saddleback Church. And my friend is a cold case detective, so he got out the Gospel of Mark and went line by line examining it through forensic science, trying to see if this is reliable. He came to the conclusion that it's true before he even understood why Jesus had to die. Isn't that interesting? But he's told me and he's written, he said, people commit crimes for 3 reasons and only 3 reasons. By the way, he's never lost a case in a court of law, ever. You maybe seen him on Dateline and Nightline and these kind of shows. He said people commit crimes for power, sex, and money. Power, sex, and money. Let's look at the apostles. Was this about power? No. Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. You were following someone who gave up all the power and who washed their feet. Is it about sex or lust? Friends, Paul was single. Jesus was single. In fact, ironically, of a lot of the great world religious leaders, Jesus might be the only one who would still pass the Me Too test today. He had opportunity to take advantage of women, but only treat them with dignity and respect and care. It's not about money. I mean, Paul writes, and the disciples say, go out and preach Jesus, but remember the poor. Remember the poor. I think from what they say we investigated, we saw the specific details they give that can be investigated, the embarrassing material they give, and their willingness to suffer and die minimally tells me they are reporting what they think is true. Let's move to the second one. People say, okay, so they thought it was true, but how do we know this book was copied faithfully if this was written about 2,000 years ago? I live in Orange County, and a number of years ago, I landed on a flight and I was standing up to get my bag down. I looked about 10 or 15 rows in front of me, and one of my good friends was on the same flight. I thought, I'll text him just so he can hang afterwards and we can catch up. So I texted him word for word. I said, hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you. And I texted it to my mom, who was home alone at night reading. Word for word, she texted me back. She goes, hey, son, I think you got the wrong punk. To this day, I wish I had just screenshotted it to have it. It was a few years ago, but it's kind of funny. In our age of the most tools of communication ever, we have more concern with fake news, don't we? Communication can break down as much now, if not ever. So how do we know we can trust a book written 2,000 years ago? This is where textual critics come in, and they are trained to examine and consider how books are written down and copied over time. And one way of doing this, not the only way, is to ask a couple sub-questions. Number one, what is the time gap between the original copies and the copies we have today? So when this book was first written down, how much time has passed to copies that we have? Now, ideally, you tell me, do we want more time or less? Less time. Then there's less room for intentional or unintentional errors or mistakes. Well, original books would be written on ancient scrolls or really ancient codices, ancient books, but then they would disintegrate. Question is, do we have the first generation, the second generation, the third generation, and so on? Well, just to give a comparison, some ancient writers such as Pliny the Elder, a rough contemporary with Jesus, the copy we have is about 700 years removed. Josephus, a Jew who wrote at the end of the first century, 800 years. Herodotus, a Greek writer, 1,500 years. Now, by the way, before we go any further, do you think most historians would believe that we can largely reconstruct these writers with a degree of confidence that we can trust? Yeah. So if you look at a lot of these writings, some are 700, 1,000, 1,400 years, some will be closer. What's the closest we have with the New Testament? Within 10 to 100 years. It's called the John Rylands Papyrus, and it's a stamp size, it's like a credit card size portion of John 18, front and back. Now, as you get in the second century and the third century, we get more copies and bigger copies, and the numbers go up. But this is why Dan Wallace, who's kind of a modern day Indiana Jones, teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary, has the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, still goes around the world and is finding and recording ancient manuscripts in libraries and communities, et cetera, that have never been recorded for posterity. He said we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Now, maybe we're different, but I don't know any Julius Caesar skeptics. I don't know any Alexander the Great doubters, but I know a lot of Jesus skeptics. And I know a lot of Jesus doubters. Why? Well, for one, some pretty radical claims are made about Jesus, so we better be able to back it up. But second, and no offense to any history teachers here, but it really doesn't matter when it's all said and done what you believe about Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. But quite literally, eternity rests on what we believe about the person of Jesus. A lot is at stake. So the first question is just how early are they? And the New Testament stands above ancient documents in terms of how early it is. The second one is how many manuscripts do we have? So now we're talking about quantity. Now, the more manuscripts we have, the more differences you'll find, but also the better chance we have of reconstructing the original because we can compare and contrast them. So if you take Caesar, we have 10 manuscripts, Plato's Tetralogy 7. In the updated new evidence, or evidence demands work, my father hired a researcher, the two of us did together, to just do the best count we could on New Testament manuscripts. The best count we have is over 24,000. Now, these are in Greek, these are in Coptic, these are in Latin, these are in a range of different languages. But if you just put the New Testament next to the number 2 book, the Iliad, it's not even close. It's like apples and oranges. So the average classical writer, if we compiled the manuscripts, would be about 4 feet high. So roughly the height of this table, roughly. How high would it be for the New Testament? Over 1 mile high. Friends, apples and oranges. Now, how many manuscripts do we have that are Greek? This is where we have about 5,300 manuscripts. By the way, manuscript is not always a full book. It could just be a portion of one. Now, over 5,300 Greek manuscripts. Now, in my little atheist role play at the beginning with those students, I actually was citing something raised by Bart Ehrman, a former Christian who's a skeptic, atheist, agnostic, brilliant textual critic. He said there's more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, he's not wrong about that, but the question is what follows from that? Well, in their excellent book, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, there's a chapter by James Prothero. He says most of these are inconsequential changes in orthography or word order. There's so many errors to speak of across the textual tradition that has so many handmade copies. In other words, we expect so many variants or differences because we have so many copies made by hand. Some have said we should expect more. Now, my friend Peter Gurry, who's an expert in textual criticism, I had a chance to interview him at least twice. He said there's roughly 500,000 non-spelling variants across Greek manuscripts. Now that still might feel like a lot to you. Let me give you a couple examples of what these entail. So if you've read the Gospel of Mark, you know that there's a theme in the Gospel of Mark, and it's specifically that Jesus is the Son of God. So the Gospel of Mark really climaxes when even the Roman centurion says, surely he was the Son of God. Now, manuscripts of Mark, early ones, differ over Mark 1:1. Some say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and some don't. There is debate over whether or not that is actually in the original Gospel of Mark. We don't know if it was there or if a textual critic or a scribe added it later for clarity. Now let's ask the question, what's at stake with this statement? And the answer is nothing whatsoever of significance. We know the Gospel of Mark explicitly teaches that Jesus is the Son of God. We just don't know if that phrase is at the beginning or not. That's an example of a variant. I'll give you another example. A friend of mine was debating an atheist who's also a friend of mine on the Trinity years ago. And I remember at one point, the atheist goes, give me one verse that explains the Trinity. And it was kind of a gotcha moment because my Christian friend was not able to give a good response. I remember sitting there going, why should we think that a doctrine has to be captured in one verse? Where does that idea come from? Now, there is a verse that captures the Trinity. 1 John 5:7 says, there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. There it is, a verse with a Trinity in it. The only problem is that verse is probably not originally in 1 John. Now, if you look in your Bible, none of this is hidden, by the way. Some actually go 1 John 6 and then it'll go 1 John 8 and people freak out and go, oh, was the Bible verse taken out of the Bible? We'll say no. As we've learned more, what used to be considered 1 John 5:7, we actually realized was probably not in the original. So there'll be footnotes in any good study Bible pointing this out. It's not a conspiracy. By the way, why does this matter? Because there's a tendency to think the further we get away from the time of Jesus, the less confidence we can have in the events that took place in our manuscripts. Do you know it's the opposite? Because of the increase in technology like drones and now artificial intelligence, we actually are gaining more confidence than we've ever had in the past. So that verse, most scholars would say is not in there. Does that mean the Trinity is not taught in the New Testament? No. It's actually harder to do than you think. Try it. Say no and go like this and you're like, anyways. I practiced it a lot and finally have it down. Yes and no. The Trinity is not at stake. One verse is that we're aware of in 1 John. Now, the only disputed New Testament passages more than 2 verses in length are the last 12 verses in Mark and a story in John 7:53 through 8:11. Anybody know what story that is? Woman at the well, which is sad for some people to hear that this is disputed because it's kind of a story we want to believe is true, right? No, it might have happened. Some manuscripts, you find it placed in other areas. But textually speaking, most scholars would conclude that the last 12 verses in Mark, which actually deals with snake handling, by the way, and that passage in John were not in the original. Now, what follows from uncertainty about those two passages? Well, what follows is we're not sure about that story in John and the last 12 verses in Mark. That's it. There's no conspiracy. Look, I hate to break it to you, But the Bible did not float down from heaven in the King James Version and just land on a podium. The Bible has been copied and translated, but with incredible care and precision, in part because of what God built into the heart of the Jewish people, a love and a reverence for the scriptures. This is why Craig Blomberg, a brilliant New Testament professor, he said, no orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. There are always undisputed passages one can teach, one can consult that teach the same truths. This is why Giorgio Pasquale, a classicist, he says, no other Greek text is handled so richly and credibly as the New Testament. So we step back and say, do we have reason to believe we can trust the character of these writers? They say we investigated and we were careful. We saw, we touched, we heard. We were eyewitnesses. They told us exactly who and when and where these events took place, not in a land far, far away. They give embarrassing detail and are willing to suffer and die for their belief they had seen the risen Jesus. Sure tells me that they at least believed this was true. But second, we have more copies and earlier copies than any other ancient book that few historians question anyways. The final test is what we call the corroboration test. Now we want to know, is there any evidence outside of this book that supports the internal claims? Friends, I'm going to take a comparison. If you take the Book of Mormon, which is about stories of Jesus coming to America and battles between different people groups, there is no good, unequivocal historical archaeological record any of that took place. That is night and day difference from the Gospels and the New Testament. I'll just give you a few. So archaeological evidence, for years, the only evidence for Pilate was literary. Until in the 1960s, this inscription was found in Caesarea Maritima. The place and the time of Pilate is actually a kind of a copy of it. The real one's in a museum, confirming that we not only have literary evidence for Pilate in the Bible, outside of the Bible, but we now have archaeological evidence. Pilate was not a fictional character. Pilate really existed. So one of my favorite examples, I took this, I think 3 or 4 years ago when I was in Israel. This is in a place called Bethesda. And it's described a miracle that Jesus performs. And there's 5 porticos that were there, like 5 colonnades. And for years, some skeptics dismissed this because the structures that they found didn't match the description in John, until they dug below and deeper, and guess what they found? I'll tell you what they didn't find. I had a freshman student doing a presentation on this. She goes, yes, skeptics didn't believe the story in John. They dug down Bethesda and found 5 porpoises. They didn't find dolphins, just for the record. That's what I get for teaching freshmen. By the way, you've probably been told there's no such thing as a stupid question. That's a lie. Just for the record. That is one example that confirms that John got it right. Years ago, this professor at Harvard wrote this. He said in the Harvard Theological Review, there's astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. And he was right. For years, there wasn't. Now, why does this matter? How do we know Jesus was crucified with nails? Remember the story in John chapter 20. What happens? Thomas wants to see the nail marks in his hand and in his feet. Yet crucified victims that were found were like with rope or some other means. So does the Bible get it wrong? Well, in 1967, this remains was found in the time and place you would expect of a man who's been dubbed Yehohanan. Now, I had a student freak out one time, like, this is not the body of Jesus. Like, don't worry about that. I know exactly. I'm like, calm down. But what does this show? This shows that the biblical writers described the way crucifixion happened, and it's been supported by an archaeological find. Now, since this, I had a chance to interview Craig Evans, who's an expert on the burial of Jesus. They have found multiple other crucified victims with nails, including one about 2 or 3 years ago in Britain, which was a part of ancient Rome, roughly around this time. And it seems the legs were possibly broken, that as described in John 19:32. Here's the way my father and I put it. Archaeology provides one important piece of evidence that helps confirm the New Testament record. Now, we haven't even begun to talk about the Old Testament. In fact, I teach in a master's program, and we have like full semesters on problem of evil, resurrection, scripture, etc. But I just want to show you one. Recently, I had a chance to interview a friend of mine named Joel Kramer, and he is an archaeologist in Jordan. And he's been into Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, 10 times. Well, what's interesting is a prophecy is made in Isaiah and in Jeremiah that Babylon would be destroyed and never rebuilt. Now, Saddam Hussein recently rebuilt his palaces. That was outside the old city walls, interestingly enough. But it also says the city would be destroyed. Now, to say that when Babylon was one of the most powerful cities in the world would have seemed ridiculous at that time. But it was destroyed, as of course we read. But it says in Isaiah and Jeremiah that there would be owls and jackals that would live in the land. And my friend Joel Kramer went there. It's destroyed, still not rebuilt. And guess what specific animals they find living in the land? Owls and jackals. It's kind of amazing. I get goosebumps thinking about it. That's just one example. I had a chance to interview him and talk about that. Friends, there are still some tough questions about the Bible. There's still some archaeological finds we need to make and uncover. But as a whole, the Bible and New Testament is not fiction. The writers report what they thought was true. They include embarrassing material because they care about truth, and they were willing to suffer for the belief Jesus had risen from the grave. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But then we have more copies and earlier copies than other ancient books people don't question. And then we find corroboration supporting the internal claims. Character, copy, and corroboration. We have good reason to believe that the New Testament and the Gospels can be trusted. Now, I know there's a ton more questions that can be raised. In some ways, we just scratched the surface. But I found for most people in conversation, if you're ready with a few thoughtful responses, that's what most people need. But with that said, I'm going to invite the two of you back up here because I suspect there's some more questions you have either from the first session left over, which is great with me, or from this related to the scriptures. So let's give it a shot. Right. You're going to go to that side. All right. I guess I'll be in the middle. So much for a rose between two thorns. If you're in the middle, we could actually do that. But, you know. I know.
That's the second time you talked about roses today. They're beautiful, aren't they?
They are objectively beautiful.
Yes.
You're listening, man. Good for you.
I'm
I don't
over
care
there
what they say.
sorting through questions and listening at the same time. Okay, so you talked a lot about the reliability of the manuscript evidence and our confidence that we have substantially original, right? Scriptures. However, there are some people who think there are other books that belong in the Bible. How do we know we have the right books?
That's a great question. Some of you will remember, it's been almost 20 years now, the whole Da Vinci Code scandal. Like everybody was talking about this at church. That was like the one time all apologists had a job to speak during the Da Vinci Code. If some of you younger don't know, there was a book that was fictional and there was a movie that was made out of it about Tom Hanks. And if I remember correctly, there's a claim that was made that there was like 80 gospels. And there was kind of a conspiracy, a power play, a little bit of a postmodern move that those who win get to decide what is true. And some gospels were left out that tell a different story about Jesus. Well, so for example, like what's called the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas. That book is completely fiction. That's what a lot of people missed. It literally was fiction. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, virtually all scholars will concede were written in the first century. These other so-called gospels, minimally in the second, many into the third, and some into the fourth. So just from a historical standpoint, even liberal dating of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is far earlier than these other so-called gospels. Now you can read them online. You can read the Gospel of Thomas. It's really just sayings. They don't read like the gospels that are really biographies. They're more sayings and have a very different feel to them because they reflect the writing and theology of the second, third, and fourth centuries. So there's no conspiracy. And by the way, when you look at the early church fathers, so you have the apostles, and then you have people who come right after the apostles. And we have some of their writings, people like Ignatius, people like Polycarp. They don't cite these so-called gospels because most of them weren't written yet, but they cite Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as if they're authoritative and reliable. We have that chain of command from the beginning. So it makes a good movie, makes a good book, but historically speaking, there's no reason to take them as being more credible historically than the four gospels that we have.
Mm-hmm.
That is real good. I gotta ask this one because somebody wants to know.
All right.
How do they become the best Christian apologists in the world? I mean, just a simple.
Wait, how do they become?
Yeah, you have some competition.
I don't know if this is a serious question.
No.
Like, did somebody really ask that?
They really did. Oh. Okay, but for real, I want to ask a different question.
I actually want to answer this.
Oh, perfect.
My goal has never been to be the best Christian apologist in the world. I had a chance to interview somebody who's my hero. Some of you might know the name Os Guinness for our podcast. And I said, Os, what do you think your legacy will be? And I'll never forget his answer. He goes, Sean, legacy is a secular idea. All that matters is God says, well done, my good and faithful servant. I don't want to be the best apologist in the world, whatever that means. I want to be faithful to the family and the abilities and the opportunities that God has given me. That's all that matters. That's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is a serious question. Well, I really appreciate that you took that seriously. That was great. Okay, how do I still keep believing when I don't feel God?
First off, I would say in a relationship with God over time, it's completely natural and normal to have those moments. I mean, somebody might say, what do I do if I'm married, but I don't feel like I love my wife or my husband? And I would say that doesn't mean you don't love them. Maybe you're going through a dry spell. Maybe you need to work on your relationship. That can happen. If that can happen at times in human relationships, that can certainly happen with God, who we can't touch and feel the same way we can with others. I mean, read the Psalms. There's times where David is like, God, where are you? You're silent. Like if that can happen with David, a man after God's own heart, the first king, I'm pretty sure that can happen with you and me. So that's why our faith needs to be rooted not in what we feel, but in what we know is true. Feelings go up and feelings go down. But if our confidence is, so think about it this way. Don't guard your mind with your heart. Guard your heart with your mind. Now, let me say one more thing. I'm sorry. I think we have an unhealthy obsession with feeling God in the evangelical church. We have an unhealthy obsession with it. Why? We associate being a good follower of Jesus with being on fire, which is typically a feeling. And so you don't feel it. You think you're not on fire anymore. The real test is, do we love people? The real test is obedience. The real test is good doctrine. So we need to move away from this unhealthy obsession with feeling that we've gotten somewhere else than from Scripture.
I really appreciate you saying that. Recently, at least I saw it, you did a podcast about knowing the will of God. And that actually reminds me of something, it's very similar in a sense, right?
I think that's right.
You got to look it up. It's really good.
That was from a Biola chapel I think I posted about a month ago. I think there's more myths on God's will within the church world, what it is and how we get it, than probably any other issue. But this has more implications because we're making decisions based on it. So if you have bad theology of God's will and decision making, you're going to make bad decisions. And I see it happen all the time because of bad theology. But
Yeah. Should we be concerned that there are so many different versions of the Bible? So all these different translations. Should that concern us?
no, it shouldn't concern us at all. In fact, I got a call earlier this week. A lady from CNN was doing a story and she's like, how do I make sense of the Gen Z Bible? And I think it's halfway serious, halfway not serious. But there's certain jargon and language that I don't understand. I'm a Gen Xer, but my son thinks is funny. Like, there's always, what's unique about the Christian worldview is, especially evangelicals, is we have an evangelistic heart and try to make the Bible as accessible to as many people as possible. That's a good thing. Now, some translations are better than other translations. That's for sure. So translations that I think I value and I think are done carefully are translations like the ESV. I really like the CSB. I think the NASB is a good, accurate translation. Now, the New Living Translation is very, very readable, but certain times is not as much a direct translation as others. So it doesn't concern me. That's a positive thing. It just concerns me when we take bad translations and assume they're good translations. If it's helpful to you, I actually did a whole podcast on 7 bad Bible translations with a friend of mine, and we walked through 7 ones you shouldn't use. And then we did a video on 7 good Bible translations. So it doesn't concern me at all in principle that there's so many, but it concerns me in practice that we don't always know how to pick a good translation and use it accordingly.
Thanks. Okay. Why do you think the disciples couldn't recognize Jesus when he resurrected?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say 2 reasons. One is, even though Jesus in Mark 8, 9, and 10 predicted his resurrection, they didn't get it. In their minds, he was the Messiah. He was going to usher in a kingdom and defeat Rome, and the resurrection was the end of time. So even though they told him, they just didn't get it. It was so revolutionary. But second, I also think it was spiritual. I think there's something to be said that God closes our eyes at times to not see certain things and opens our eyes at other times. And that's specifically true with the apostles. I think there was a spiritual blindness. I mean, look at Luke 24. the disciples with Jesus. It's like their hearts were warming, but until Jesus removed the scales, so to speak, then they could see anew. So in some ways, being blind and then seeing is also symbolic that there is something new taking place here. I'm giving you new eyes to see the world, and including the Old Testament in a way you hadn't before.
Thank you.
That'd be my best guess.
Yeah. Interesting. Multiple people asked this question. I found it interesting that it was on the minds of multiple ones of us. It has to do with the things that aren't in the Bible, not the things that are. So, for example, why doesn't the Bible talk about Jesus' teenage years? Why is that missing? Should that worry us that there are things missing? Does that call into question or cause doubt that there are certain things the Bible does not talk about?
So the fact that we are asking that question makes sense in the age in which we live. I guess the point I'm making is this question is a product of our expectations of what biography should entail. So someone's writing a biography today. I want to know what you were like in third grade, and I want to know what you were like in junior high. Tell me your life because your life is important just because you are you, whoever you are. That's not the way biographies were done in the ancient world. And the four Gospels are kind of ancient biographies. They're very similar to other ancient biographies. And they would focus on a person's life that was germane to advancing the larger mission of that person's life. So while the teenage years would be interesting, presumably they would not have been as illustrative about who Jesus was and what he accomplished rather than his birth. One story when he's 12, which makes a very important point, and then it's really when he's 30 that they focus on because that's when he starts his ministry. Even the Gospels, by the way, I forget the percentage, but it's like a third of some of the Gospels are just the last week of the life of Jesus. So if we understand the way ancient biographies were written, I don't think it should concern us at all. Now, I still want to know what happened in, junior high with Jesus, et cetera, but we're not told that, but it's not germane to what the Gospels are about.
Before Christy closes with some information about tomorrow, ice cream or insulin? Sean McDowell was a good college basketball player.
Oh, man. So I'll be totally honest with you. I walked on the team at Biola and I sat the bench for 3 years. I sat the bench 3 years. My senior year, I had a chance to be the captain. I was a backup point guard and I played probably 10 to 15 minutes a game. And I was just glad to be on the floor. Now my team was 30-7. So compared to other college basketball players, I was probably average at best, but I took care of the ball. I worked my tail off. I loved being on the team and just knew I had a certain role. And we were 30-7 my senior year, 28-6 my junior year. So my team was better than average, but I just did what I did to be a part of the team.
I figured you needed to know that Sean was a college basketball player.
I mean, that's the honest answer, but it was fun. I loved it. I was like my first 3 years, I don't even know why I'm telling you this.
Because it's awesome.
But the Biola students would literally yell Rudy, if you know that movie. They're like, oh yeah, he's that kid who, he's just playing hard and get in there and get a bucket. They stopped my senior year, which I took as a compliment. I'm like, okay, I'm actually playing and contributing, but I just was all heart, love the game. That's the way to describe me. And by the way, you played college hoops too. 5'4", played college hoops. Let's go.
I was hoping
on.
he'd say that, by the way. We discovered that was something we had in common.
Awesome.
And I didn't play except for in one game.
Hey, just so you know, that is one more game than 98% of people in the audience.
Thank you, brother. Can we give it up for Sean and thank him for being here and sharing with us tonight?
Thank you.